Hello and welcome to our first lecture on sociological research. As an undergraduate student, you probably aren't going to be asked to run sociological research. However, it's important that you understand how sociological research is produced. Understanding how research is produced in the social sciences can help you think critically about information that is presented to you in courses like this one. And it will improve your understanding of the processes of producing research by helping you to become a better consumer of sociological information that surrounds you in your everyday life. This year is an election year here in the United States, and you're probably hearing a great deal about the polls. If you've read newspapers or magazines, you're going to encounter survey information. In fact, if you have one of those nice little iPhones, you're going to get survey information sent to you almost on a daily basis. And if you aren't actively seeking research information, it's still probably going to come to you. And one of the best ways to critically assess research is to become familiar with the scientific method. Prior to the scientific method, a lot of the information we had was religiously based, or a lot of the information came from personal experience, and we had a great deal of superstition. But at some point in the history of science, we decided we needed to have a way of organizing how we look at information in order to make information more consistent, as well as making it more objective. And so we developed the scientific method. And in the social sciences, sociology included, we use the scientific method, which has 5 basic steps. So our first step is to define the problem. And probably, as you're reading your sociology text, you have started coming up with all sorts of questions about society and how things work together. If you look at the study that was discussed in the beginning of the chapter, you're going to remember that Patricia and Peter Adler did research on self-harming behaviors. So they became interested in why people harm themselves or perform acts of self-mutilation. And the early point in their consideration of this question, the Adlers would have had to have created an operational definition of the problem that they were interested in. They would have had to decide what behaviors they wanted to look at. They would have have decided if they were interested in all actions that people engage in that cause pain. For example, they would have to have decided if they were interested in including tattooing and piercing into the behaviors that they were looking at. They would have had to decide if they wanted to include any behavior that creates pain, if they wanted to include any behavior that leads to harm. And in their operationalization of their problem, they decided that they wanted to look at self-harming behaviors that were not used in conjunction with an attempt to commit suicide. So it got fairly specific. Once they identified their question, they then had to conduct a review of the literature, which is our second step. and each field has its own base of knowledge, and it can be fairly large depending. So just out of curiosity, I decided to do a Google search related to this particular topic and see what happened. So I put in scholarly articles on self-mutilation. And although this isn't how scientists locate relevant research, it was something that ended up giving me a very interesting bit of information. With this simple research, I turned up 199,000 relevant articles. And that's overwhelming. Obviously, as a researcher, you're not going to want to read that many articles. However, luckily, it covered all sorts of different fields of interest. This particular search turned up resources for people who commit self-injury, articles run by medical professionals dealing with people who perform self-injury, a Time article on the instance of self-injury, as well as articles in self-harm as it pertains to many different cultures. So you can gather a whole bunch of information just by a simple Google search. And as sociologists, we would focus on academic articles. We wouldn't just read anything, but when you do put into your search scholarly literature, you actually will find that you pull up a great many journal articles. And so, yeah, you can start that way if that's something that interests you. From a review of the literature, then we would get a better idea of exactly what we were looking at and what is already known about our question. This would help us to further define the question, and it might change our operational definition. For example, if the Adlers started off looking at self-harm but hadn't decided that they weren't interested in self-harm that was done in an attempt to commit suicide, they may have found that there was a very different way people harm themselves if they're intending to commit suicide, and then at that point they may have gone back and changed their operational definition to limit it a little bit. So this could help us further define the question that we have before us, and it's also going to help us in our third step, which is developing a hypothesis. Now, if you're following along with your PowerPoint, you're going to realize at this stage that there are two very important variables that we're looking at in our hypothesis. In the most simple language, a hypothesis is a guess about two different variables and how they're related to each other. So we're interested in our independent variable, which is the variable that our hypothesis uses to cause or influence the variable in question. And we're also interested in our dependent variable, which is what our research is investigating. So in the example of the Adlers, the variable that we're interested in is behaviors of self-harm. And the independent variable would depend on how we've actually defined our hypothesis. We may, for example, through our literature review, find out that a lot of people who practice self-harm have very few friends, and so we might in that instance create a hypothesis that says people with few friends are more likely to commit self-mutilation. In that instance, our dependent variable would remain self-mutilation, and our independent variable would be the number of friends that people have. Once we establish our hypothesis, we would go on to our fourth step, which is the collection of our data. And as you see in your PowerPoint, and as you no doubt discovered in the text, there's several ways that we collect data, and we will design research around our question and our hypothesis and how we want to look at that. We can do surveys, we can do observation, we can run experiments, or we can look at existing sources of information and do what's referred to as a secondary analysis. But regardless of what we do, our fourth step is going to be some form of data collection. And if you remember, the Adlers actually went through the process of in-depth interviews. Once we have obtained our data, then we go on to our fifth step, which is developing our conclusion. Once we've developed our data, we also run our analysis. So if you're working with numbers, you're going to do your statistical analysis after you've collected it, and that's going to lead you to your conclusion. Now, it's really important that you remember that your conclusion can be that your hypothesis was wrong. Generally, we don't see a great deal of research in the literature about research that proved its hypothesis to be wrong, but every once in a while we do, because it might have been a really interesting phenomenon. And we are going to come back and we'll be continuing with our major research designs later.